Here goes another Yakut creepypasta. It is a little atypical for local folklore because evil spirits, a boss, are usually not described as corporeal beings, but as indistinct, or in the form of silhouettes, hiding in darkness, with their faces being impossible to properly make out. They suddenly appear and disappear, etc., well, as in all the other pastas. Nevertheless, this story is frequently told at campfire, and some local writers even wrote stories based on it. Again, it concerns two brothers. To the elder one is about 30, younger one is about 5 years younger. Both were professional hunters, and autumn come, both went deep into the deep woods, where the game is not yet spooked by man, for a couple of months. It was not their first foray, so they were reasonably seasoned and did not worry about anything. The woods were like a home to them. They settled down near some nameless river in the woods, quickly built a makeshift hut, made a campfire, in accordance with the local tradition fed the spirit of fire, and through it, all other local spirits, with food and alcohol to get their patronage, and went off to hunt. There was a lot of game. In just 2 or 3 days they shot a crapload and were already joyfully rubbing their hands, imagining how much money they stood to get for all of it. This was during Soviet times. Somewhere around the 4th or 5th day the first snow went down. It was evening and the brothers were sitting in their hut after a day's hunting, have their supper, talking of this and that. The fire burns, it is warm and cozy in the hut, and suddenly they hear the sound of footsteps outside. It was heard clearly due to the fresh snow. Their first reaction was to grab the guns. What if it's a bear? But no, the steps are quite human. Their sound approaches to the door, and a female voice says, "Brr, so cold." The brothers were dumbstruck. Meanwhile the door opened, and a young woman, quite beautiful, in good clothes enters the hut. Truth to be told, it was a little old-fashioned for the Soviet times, but fashion was not the chief concern in the woods, keeping war was. Having seen the brothers, she joyfully says that she is from a village nearby, left for a walk in the woods and got lost, had been wandering all day long and was getting ready to meet her doom, when she had noticed the brothers' campfire. The brothers exchange worrisome glances. They had good knowledge of the area, and there was no villages in a 300 kilometers radius. But the woman was quite real, shivering from the cold, and they, being the gentlemen that they are, courteously invite her to sit by their table, and have some tea and soup. She eats all that with gratitude, tells them about herself, how, supposedly, frightened she was and how grateful to them she is now, etc. The elder brother is quickly swayed by the beautiful stranger, and only responds with occasional nods, while the younger one, Sho was quite a shut-in in his daily life, only keeps glancing at the guest with suspicion. Having found the right moment, he excuses himself from the hut under the pretext of having to take a leak. It was already getting darker, but terribly so. He follows the woman's footsteps on the fresh snow further and further into the woods, and eventually finds himself at the coast of the small river. The river did not freeze yet. If the woman crossed it, she would all be wet. The younger brother's suspicions grow as he recalls all kinds of dark ancient hunters' tales of eldritch evil spirits that live in the deep woods, and according to the legends, these spirits are so ball-crushingly powerful that next to them any regular boss is child's play. Ultimately, he decides on sharing his thoughts with his brother and work out the plan on the go. When he returns to the hut, the party has already started, a liquor bottle is open, love is in the air, and the elder brother is clearly thinking with his dick rather than his head by now. And who can blame him? He is not married, and the woman looks very appetizing, and doesn't seem to mind his advances. Younger brother tries to slip into their conversation, "Our hunting equipment's becoming wet under the snow, let's go and get it," but only gets a laconic piss-off in response, while the woman, for just a single moment, glances at him with such non-feminine, even in human eyes, that the younger brother immediately shits bricks and moves away. He sits gloomy by himself in a corner. Meanwhile the older brother's tryst with the woman is moving closer and closer to the bed. But he does manage to snatch the right moment when his brother has to go outside before going to a bed. He tries to tell him all about the footsteps, about the terrible look the woman gave him, and that her story holds to no scrutiny, but all the elder brother can see is incoming pussy, in addition to Bane drunk. It all ends when the elder brother corners the younger against the wall of the hut and promises to disperse a good beating if he keeps on it. Younger brother is dumbstruck. His brother was never like this, not even when drunk. Finally, the couple settled in a corner of the hut, and put a makeshift screen between themselves and the rest of the hut. As light goes out, the younger brother quietly lies in the other corner, listens attentively to the characteristic sounds and droops. Just in case, however, he keeps his loaded double-barreled gun under the blanket. And so he lies there, as the love-making continues, and he is soon overcome by sleep. He is woken up by a gnashing sound. Since the coals are still lit, he deduces, it hasn't been long. The strange gnash obviously comes from a corner where the woman and the older brother lie, and each gnash is followed by either a groan, or a quiet wail in his brother's voice. The younger brother jumps up from his bed and with a gun raised rushes to the other corner. As he pushes the screen aside with one hand, keeping the gun ready in another, he sees that his brother is sat on by some dark silhouette of not-so-female shape, with the blazing yellow eyes taking half its face, gnawing on his brother's neck, and the sound must be that of teeth meeting vertebrae. The elder brother only quietly groans. Younger brother very nearly fainted from such a grisly sight, but nevertheless unloaded his gun right between the creature's eyes. With a loud squeal, the creature jumped off its prey and made a run for the exit. Sometimes retellings add that before leaving it hissed, "Should have finished you off first." Younger brother shoots again, the creature lets out another scream and dashes out of the hut, crashing down the door on its way. Younger brother hurries to nudge the coals for at least some light and checks on his brother, but it is already too late, for his eyes were rolled up, the throat was gnawed through and through, and all the bed was covered in blood. Another strange detail is that later the younger brother did not find any traces of blood on the floor or at a door, despite hitting the creature twice with his gun. As soon as dawn came, the surviving brother ran back to the settlement. He then returned with the team of men to take his dead brother's body to dismantle the hut. Since then, Alysardakh, the small river of evil spirits, was what the river was called. There was a man, by the way, in our village, a hunter too, who claimed that this Alysardakh was in the Aldon-Ulus. Translator's note: Ulus is a complex term, meaning something like land, peoples, or district, and that he has been to those places a few times. And once even spent the night at the small river, and nothing supernatural had happened. Who knows? I think this will be the last one for today. It's really getting late, and I will try to do more in the morning if the thread's still alive, or I will just start a new one.
You are welcome. I was happy to help. Anyway, here's another story. I will do a couple more, and then I have to go on an errand. I will do more when I come back. I first heard this story when I was a child. It is almost archetypal for Yakutia. I have heard different versions of it at least 3 times. They say, before the revolution there were many legends of invisible flatmates of different degrees of brick-shitting potential among the people. This one is the spookiest. Once upon a time an old man went into the woods to chop some firewood, accompanied by his son and grandchildren. They had a big family: grandfather, grandmother, their eldest son with a wife and 2 children, and the younger son with his wife. The weather was good, and many trees were felled on that day. But in the late afternoon they came across one especially strong and big large tree, seemingly impervious to axe, as if made of stone. Even a chainsaw could not take that tree, the chain would get stuck every other minute. The son suggested to leave the tree alone. There were many more in the forest, after all, but felling the strange tree now became a matter of personal pride for the grandfather. They labored all evening long, but their efforts were rewarded in the end. Thus they finished the day's work. After a while the day came when they had to load the chopped down trees onto the tractor trailer in order to transport them back to their village. It was here that the tree showed its colors yet again. Despite the men's best efforts to load it onto the trailer, the tree rolled back down at least 6 times, completely by itself. It fell down once again on the way home, even though it should have been prevented from doing so by all the wood surrounding it. Finally they managed to reach the village, and on the next day began to chop the wood. As one of grandsons lowered the axe onto the tree, it jumped right off it and hit him bluntly on the forehead. Seeing that, the old man became agitated and ordered that tree to be dealt with first of all. Spending the whole day, they did ultimately manage to saw and split it down into firewood. The grandfather personally brought an armful of the firewood from the tree into the house and into the furnace. Naturally, it had no intention of playing along and simply refused to burn, but the grandfather was a quitter. He added gasoline and some old newspapers, and the fire was finally kindled. Firewood lit ablaze, and the old man wiped his forehead from sweat and let out a victorious laugh, celebrating his triumph over the piece of damned wood. The brick-shitting began the very same evening, and not slowly and hazily over the course of months, like in those American horror movies, but right away and with full power. The family had just finished supper, and suddenly the daughter-in-law, the younger son's wife, let out a scream. As all looked at her, she said that someone had just hit her on the face. The family thought she went loony, but then it happened again, and with such strength that her head was jerking left and right all the time. The grandfather tried to cover her face with his hands, but only managed to become the present's new target. He was punched in the guts, followed by whipping on the face. When the grandfather, having shat enough bricks to build a Kremlin, ran out from the house, the invisible entity took to the daughter-in-law again. All evening long it had tormented her, and only appeared to have been satiated when both her cheeks became red as a crawfish. But it was too early to celebrate. Come night, it found its way into her bed, threw off the blanket and began to smother her, pressing down with huge force. Everyone is spooked, the girl is in tears, the men understand nothing, the grandfather clutches the head. Having understood that the fucking tree wasn't so simple after all, they invited the local priest. As soon as the priest, armed with a cross, a censer, and holy water, entered the house, the entity was right there to spill all the holy water, broke the censer, tore the cross from his neck and threw it into a corner, and proceeded to do what it does best, whipping the priest on the cheeks. Thus the priest ran away as soon as he came. Thus a very cheerful life began. In the morning and during the day the entity would usually calm down, but still made its presence known by way of small dirty tricks. Putting cow shit wool into the milk, spoiling the dough, breaking cups on the shelves. Every evening it would take its time with the girl, beating her, grabbing her clothes, putting muck into her food, feeling her up at night. It would, however, ignore everyone else, including the grandfather, unless they came to the girl's defense. If they tried, however, it would wrestle them, and much more brutally than it would the girl. The men could easily end up with severe bruises and broken bones. And they could never even grab or hit it anyway. The grandfather came for help to the local shaman, but he refused to come to their house, explaining that the evil spirit was obviously stronger than him. As everyone agreed that the entity came to them with the tree, in which it probably used to live, the shaman advised them to take the firewood from that tree back to where the tree stood. The family followed his advice, and on their way there they encountered no tricks from the wood. Alas, it did not help. The flatmate must have found the village more fun than the forest. And thus they lived for a whole month. They tried all they could, from coal circles on the floor to prayers and cats, but nothing seemed to work. And after each attempt to kick it out, the presence would pay back tenfold. Eventually all that had started to take a toll on the girl, and she began to go crazy and wither away, spouting mad ravings. By the way, it was during that period that they had a visit from a Chekist, translator's note. An officer of Cheka, the Soviet secret police, who had heard the rumors and decided that locals were purposely spreading superstition. He announced himself with an exclamation. Well, so where this monster of yours?" And at that very moment the gun that was hanging from his belt shot by itself. The Chekist very nearly lost his dick. He grabbed his belt, and at that same moment horse feces started flying at him from the furnace. The Chekist, panicking, pulled out the gun and checked the furnace, but found no one there. That's when the entity started whipping his face like it did before. The officer dashed out of the house to never return. Finally, it was decided to send the girl to her relatives in another village. On the way through their village, she kept looking back and crying, saying, "My poor Abasi cannot keep up with us, lags behind, calls me back," and when they left the village, my poor Abasi is left to cry by a birch tree. And suddenly the madness have vanished, and her mind has returned to her. Naturally, she had no desire to ever come back to that village, and the marriage broke up. The village, though, did not particularly mind either. As soon as she left, the entity had disappeared, and all of its tricks and games had stopped. For some time the family still jumped at the sight of each shadow, expecting their tormentor to return, but it never happened. Most likely, the Abasi became bored without the girl, and returned back to the woods. Happy end, as they say. Today I will a little tell about such phenomenon as Keritii, the walk, an analog of air ordeals in Christianity. It is believed that after death, the soul does not leave this world right away, instead visiting all the places the person had been to in life. For 90% of the local villagers, though, it's limited to their home village and its adjacent areas. The main difference of the walk from the Christian ordeals is that it is not at all invisible or inaudible. When such spirit makes is around, some people can hear strange sounds and voices carried through the sky, and particularly sensitive people can even behold this process. Also, the word Keritii in Yakut language contains an element of enforcement. The spirit does not perform the walk by its own free will, but rather is forced to do it by the higher powers. Anyway, my grandma's sister had seen plenty in her youth. By the time she was 40, her eyesight had worsened, and she had to undergo a couple of operations, and as a result she could barely see. Although she herself had explained that she was too sharp-eyed, and others did not want her to peer into their affairs. When I was a kid she used to tell me very spooky stories. One such story is about the walk. So, a very long-lived man had died and was buried a couple days prior. The grandmother's sister, along with the others, went to the fields for haymaking. The deceased man, naturally, had spent much time there himself in his life, and so visiting the fields during his walk was quite logical. Sometime after lunch she suddenly heard strange sounds like a dog howl mixed up with crying. She stopped working to look around and saw in the distance some strange object, reminiscent of a vaulting horse, floating in the air, with someone sitting on it, and on both sides from it there were two dark vaguely human-shaped silhouettes, seemingly beating on with some sticks. It was that man, who was taking the beating, that was the source of the strange howl. The grandma's sister shat bricks, and looked around to check if the others saw it too, but nobody did, except her. By that time she had already gotten used to sometimes seeing what others could not, so she kept observing silently. The strange procession floated alongside the road by the field. As she was in the field far away from the road, she could not see the dark beings clearly, nor did she want to. But at some point she somehow understood, whether by the voice, or by the appearance, that the person riding the horse, the one who was taking the beating, was the recently deceased man. It left a very heavy impression on her. The Yakut lore does not usually associate the walk with such BDSM practices, and the deceased man was too decent in life to be treated like that after death. Thus, she was sure she bore witness to the process of the walk. After that, whenever there was a funeral in the village, she could sometimes vaguely heard indistinct voices and sounds reaching from as if from the sky in the evenings, but saw nothing. Something like that. Cool, take your time, Anon. Today we will talk about the Yakut zombies. Yes, there's a place for them even in the Yakut beliefs, and zombies in Yakutia fall into two categories, Ur and Deretnik. Articles like Ur, Yakut zombie 11 are published in the local yellow papers from time to time, especially during a Christmastide. Therefore the first kind is much better known, although it is Deretnik that is more like the classic Hollywood zombie. So, Ur is, in fact, not a reanimated corpse, but rather a wayward soul of a dead person. It is believed that at a certain point after death the person is asked a question, well, wanna go further on ahead, or do you want to hang out in the mortal world a bit longer? 99% agree to leave, but some, not especially eager to leave this world behind, opt to stay. Then the skin is ripped from their face. Don't ask how a spirit can be skinned, beats me. The head is turned by 180 degrees, and in such a state they are sent back to Mother Earth. By the way, if the cause of death was a suicide, this can be inflicted with no one even asking you anything, since suicides are severely frowned upon in the Yakut religion. Back on Earth, this mutilated spirit hides out around place of its death. It is afraid of light, constantly suffering from cold, and it generally sucks to be in its place, and soon it begins to regret its choice, and gets pissed. When its rage reaches a point when it will attack any unfortunate traveler who comes to its dwelling on sight, that's it, a Ayur is ready. It's not much like movie zombies though, being more similar to a regular Abasi, although it is sometimes said that a Ayur can simply beat a man to death, which doesn't happen often with regular evil spirits. Remember the pasta about a Christmastide fortune telling? It is likely that the elder brother was killed by a Ayur there, at least that's what it looks like. A Ayur is not eternal, however. After very long time, at least several decades, sometimes centuries, it just kind of dissipates, loses its power and finally leaves the earth behind. It is not absolutely clear happens to such lost soul afterwards, as the lore is not very clear on the subject. Deretnik is another thing entirely. It is an actual reanimated corpse, possessed by evil spirits. A Deretnik can be created one of several ways: an evil shaman that has bequeathed his body to demons, certain suicides, as well as ordinary people that were devoured by an especially powerful Abasi. Deretniks are very similar to the American zombies. They lose all the personality they had in life, decay, often cannot speak distinctly, move convulsively and jerkily, are inhumanely strong and fast, are impervious to mutilations and are eager to kill and devour. If a person is to become a Deretnik, then usually occurs within a day or so after the person's death, unless he or she is buried in a particular way, in accordance with special rules. If the rules are not followed, well, it gets grisly. What follows is a popular pasta about a Deretnik. Evening found two friends, both hunters, lost in deep woods, on an unfamiliar territory. It was during summertime, therefore it was not particularly really dark at night, and so they decided to forsake sleeping and to try and find their way through the woods instead. By midnight they found themselves in some especially deep thicket. One of hunters was one of those particularly sensitive to the supernatural, and it was his opinion that they should leave that place as soon as possible. Something didn't smell right. In that very moment something human-shaped had appeared from behind the trees and rushed the hunters. Before they could react, one hunter was felled, the psychic one, and bitten on the shoulder. The other hunter, meanwhile, came to his sense and hit the creature on the head with a stick, and followed that with an up-close burst from his shotgun. The creature squealed loudly and as if evaporated. Sorry for the delay, I accidentally deleted the whole text and had to start anew. The hunter rushed to his wounded friend's aid, but was stopped as he screamed at him, "Do not come near me." He then explained that he felt his death was near, and that he would become a Deretnik too, and that the place was most likely the creature's nest. The friend tried to protest, "Come on, we will get you to the road, catch a ride, we will get to a hospital," but the wounded hunter said none of it would work, as he was as good as dead already. The only thing left to do was to make sure the funeral rites were observed. As he was speaking, he began to turn pale, his eyes bulged, his veins blew up. He did not look good at all. He instructed his friend to cut off his head, and bury the body right there and then, deep enough without a casket or a cross, belly down, and to put his severed head between his legs face down, with some dirt put into its mouth, and then run away from that forsaken place. The friend is dumbstruck, but it was the ancient funeral rites to prevent a person from becoming a Deretnik. If so to bury, then the Deretnik will not be able to rise. While the wounded man spoke, he kept becoming worse and worse, until blood flowed from his mouth and he was dead. And there was the surviving hunter, standing near his dead friend's corpse, in the middle of the night, thinking what to do next. He did not dare commit such atrocities to his friend's corpse, and so he simply dug a grave, put the body there, face down, hung up some fabric onto a nearby tree to mark the grave for later, and went off to look for the road, shivering at the thought of encountering the creature again. He was walking for 2, maybe 3 hours, and dawn was close. Suddenly he heard the cracking sound of footsteps in the distance behind him. The hunter picked up his walking pace and readied the shotgun. But the strange noise was quickly heading his way, as if knowing precisely where he was. The hunter shat bricks, but nevertheless turned around and prepared to meet whoever, or whatever, it was head on. The noise was coming closer and closer, and at last the late friend jumps at him from behind the bushes covered in dirt top to bottom, hair disheveled, skin covered with cadaveric spots, eyes not moving, clothes tattered, and some tubules hanging from mouth and ears. Whether those were veins or snot, the hunter could not tell. As the Deretnik saw the hunter, it rushed forward, like a wolf, growling, twitching, clattering its teeth. The hunter took a shot at him, but missed, while the creature was near him in an instant and in one swift blow sent him flying several meters through the air. The hunter, fortunately, did not let go of his gun, so he took another shot, and hit the creature's head. But it did little to stop the Deretnik, as the nearly headless corpse was still somehow unmistakably sensing the hunter's location. It only calmed down after taking several more shots to its torso and limbs. When the monster was felled, the hunter quickly dug a new grave, cut off what little remained of its head, and this time buried it precisely as he was told earlier by the friend. He bailed as soon as he was done. Nothing chased him this time, and he soon found a road. By the way, sometimes a bit is added to the story where later the deceased friend visits the hunter in a dream, and thanks him for doing everything correctly, although not without reproaching him for not doing so at once. Saying that because of this incident he might have some serious problems on the other side. Sup, Yakut here again to give you some more pastas from my homeland's folklore. I think I mentioned the spirit patron of the hunt called Bainai. Of all the Yakut pantheon of the nature spirits, it is one of the most venerated, almost on par with the patron of horse breeding Jesege. Horses for Yakuts are almost sacred, not unlike cows in India, and only a couple of ranks below the spirit of fire Hayden Timiriyi. This one, generally, is held in almost as high regard as the elder gods. Bainai, naturally, lives in the woods, which are quite abundant in Yakutia. It is believed that he has a ledger of all the hunters of Yakutia, and that he can bestow as much game on a hunter as he can deprive one of. So, if you respect local rules, do not offend the spirits, are not greedy, and, of course, good at hunting, you can count on Bainai's patronage, and game will practically fall right into your hands. The spirit does not like to appear before pathetic mortals, and laying eyes on him is considered a sign of great luck. You ask what's so spooky? Well, there were some cases. Here's one legend, for example. A group of hunters ventured into the deep woods. A serious expedition too, mostly consisting of seasoned graybeards and professional hunters. They settled down near some nameless river, set up the camp, went to hunt. Only they couldn't get any game whatsoever. It's not like there were no animals in the forest, one could spot them quite easily here and there, and it's not that the hunters weren't good at their craft, they were simply having a patch of bad luck. On the third night, while the hunters were all sleeping in their makeshift shack, the youngest, and the most green guy, who only recently came of age, saw a dream. A drop-dead gorgeous woman had jumped out of the river, and, her wet clothes sticking to her body, went up directly to his bed and smiled. The guy smiled back, everything was fine, but then the woman threw a discontented glance at all the old men snorting around and left back for the woods. The guy woke up, didn't understand a thing, and went back to sleep. She came back in the next night's dream. This time she began to embrace and kiss him, but as soon as the guy tried to pull her closer, she kept evading his touch, repeating that it wasn't the time yet. This kept happening for the next several nights, and the hunters during the day were having no more luck than the young man in his dreams. More and more consideration was given to the idea of leaving and going to another place. The young man didn't really care, being a noob in the hunting matters, and relied entirely on his comrades' opinions and expertise. Only he couldn't forget the woman his wet dreams, and could only think about making love to the cutie. On the next night the woman spilled the beans. "I would love to," she says, "but all these old farts ruin the mood." Smiling deviously, she whispers, "In 3 days' time, these old men of yours will fuck off, while you, sweetie, should stay here, and everything will be okay." The guy woke up and became depressed. Walking the woods, he felt torn apart. What was he supposed to do? On one hand, it was just a dream, no big deal. On the other, there obviously was a reason the woman visited his dreams every night, and so warm and sweet she seemed, that he felt he couldn't live without her. But then again, what if she was some eldritch horror, merely pretending to be a cute girl to trap and eat him? Who could know? See one of pastas from before. The guy was quite angsty. Next day came, and the elder hunters decided to cut the losses and return home, as they were clearly having no luck, and began to gather their belongings. Only our hero did not move, and just sat quietly with a blank stare. They asked him what was the matter, but he remained silent, thinking only of the dream woman, but also scared of her. The old men tried to get to him for some time, but, having achieved no success, decided that the guy had gone mad. And the simplest course of action would be to tie him up and drag him home. He did not protest. Guy started the head, and all attacked on him, bound hand and foot. The guy did not begin to protest. And thus they all returned home. Back home, the guy's father was furious. "Your grandfather," he said, "was a great hunter, and I had potential too, and only living in the city made me choose a different life. Bainai himself took notice of you," he said, "that was his handiwork, would have made you a real Yakut hunter, had you stayed. It was right in front of you, you only had to reach for it. Now you will be no one for the rest of your life." And so it was. They had a long life, and not too shabby, but he was not happy, as he felt that he was meant for something else, and whenever he went to hunt, couldn't even get a rabbit. All beasts great and small would flee from him, inexplicably sensing his presence. Bainai now held a grudge against him. Generally speaking, the shamans are a rich and juicy topic in its own right. Before the revolution, there were many, almost every village had a shaman, but later, with the advent of communism, along with enforcement of atheism and removal of all superstitions that came with it, their headcount had dropped severely. Yet, even nowadays, the few that remain are held in highest regard, and people come to visit them for advice or help from all corners of the Republic, when they can find no help elsewhere. The Yakut Shamans are divided into 3 castes, based on their power level: lesser, medium and great. It depends on a genes, as well as personal knack. The great shamans are very few, and each could directly contact the eldest god of the Yakut faith, Urong Aartoyan. Shamans are also divided into predatory, black, shamans and not predatory, white. Largely there is no real difference, it's only that predatory shamans do not shun to use their powers against pathetic mortals, and are feared for it. Usually, however, shamans did not exercise their power by killing ordinary people, except for bitter enemies. But they competed greatly among themselves. Great shamans waged wars on each other for most of their lives, casting curses on each other, and did not rest a moment. Interestingly, female shamans, Budaganchas, you could count all known historical cases with the fingers of one hand, were considered a step above male shamans. Generally, if a woman became a shaman, she would be great, or at a medium one. The most powerful one, Alysardakh, killed over half of great shamans of her time, and left the others alive just for lols. According to the lore, the initiation of shamans would happen in the early childhood, usually coinciding with the beginning of puberty, or earlier. For example, initiation of the 9th, Tungus, the great shaman from the USD Aldynsky district, happened as follows. The boy was 9 years old, and he was left home alone in the afternoon, as his parents had left on business. He sat in the hut and was playing on the floor, when he heard the sound of a stampede of what must have been a whole army of horses. The boy, naturally, got spooked and hid under a bed by a wall. The horse noises had stopped, followed by someone's heavy footsteps, heading towards the hut, and not towards the door, but rather straight towards the bed the boy was hiding under. Outside the wall, opposite of the boy, a loud voice said, "There were you." At last, 9 years' search is over. The boy immediately fainted. The parents, having returned home, found the kid lying on the floor, delirious and in a fever. Naturally, they sent for a doctor and a shaman. The shaman, having examined the boy, forbade to touch him. "Let him lie," he said, "only do not forget to feed him." High Soul had already left the body and was far, far away, in between the worlds, undergoing shaman initiation rites. About this in-between, it is most commonly said that the spirit envoy delivers the chosen one's soul to one of Yakutia's sacred places, and that's where the real shit goes down, known as the dismemberment. You can tell by the name alone that it's not gonna be pretty. I will try to retell, as well as I remember it, the memoirs of one medium shaman that I read when I was a child. There was a storm that day, and I left for the meadow to get our cow and the calf back to the barn. Leading them across the meadow, I saw a giant tree appear in a flash of lightning in the very center of the meadow, with a strange bird sitting at its top and staring at me. I felt uneasy from its heavy stare, and I felt as if I was falling down. By the way, the kid was found only next morning on the edge of the forest, naked, having climbed to the top of some tree and shivering all over. After he was brought home, he went into a coma for 3 months, only opening his mouth during feeding. Therefore the events described below take place during those 3 months of unconsciousness. I woke up at top of an enormous mountain overlooking a wide river with a very strong heavy current. Based on the description, this nameless sacred mountain is overlooking the Lena River, the place where, according to their accounts, many Yakut shamans had passed their initiation. The location of the mountain, by the way, is unknown, neither is it known whether or not it is there at all. For some time I simply laid on my back, staring the boundless sky high above me, unable to move. Then a huge man with a bear's head casually approached me with a pike and a huge axe. He plunged the pike into the ground, and then beheaded me with the axe. It did not hurt. After that he put my head on the pike so that I could see what was happening with my lifeless body. He methodically chopped my body into small pieces of flesh over the course of several hours, and after he was done, 3 creatures, reminiscent of birds with human faces, descended onto the mountain from the heavens. They began to sort the pieces of my flesh into several heaps, arguing about something among themselves. They also scolded the bear head for managing to loose one of my fingers somewhere. After they left, I saw a cloud of metallic color approaching from the north. A horde of demonic beings descended from the cloud and began to devour my flesh from the left heap, clearly enjoying the process. Strangely, they did consume any, vomiting my flesh right back, and sometimes not even swallowing, only licking. They then departed, and a copper cloud arrived from the west. Other humanoid-looking creatures went down from it, approached the central heap, and the process repeated itself. Then a gray cloud came from the south with giggling pale creatures who had invited themselves to the right heap of flesh. At last, when they all left, the 3 bird creatures returned and began to reassemble my body from the pieces, using their own plentiful saliva as glue. I with the watched peaks with surprise how meat grows together, muscles and bones. This process seemed to have lasted for ages. Eventually the bear head pulled my head off the pike and put next to my body, and as one of the bird creatures skillfully licked around the neck, my head became reattached to the body. I fell, having no strength to stand, and heard them majestically proclaim, "Now you are free. Rise," on the highest command created, by the North Anointed, medium shaman. I immediately fainted again and then regained consciousness back home on my bed. I was told that 3 months had passed since I got sick. To elaborate, his astral body was split into little pieces and tied to the spirit patrons of the north, west, and south which arrived for the occasion, and since the initiation happened on a sacred place of the north, he became a shaman, a North Anointed shaman. It is believed that a spirit that was present at the initiation of a shaman and feasted on his body will from that point on good terms with him and will obey his requests. For the same reason initiation of a great shaman lasts longer, since the body is divided into smaller pieces, and there are far more guests wishing to get a piece of him. There are many legends of the Udagansha Alysardakh, whom I mentioned previously, how she would destroy the rivaling shamans, and what lulls she had from proving various skeptics wrong. I will tell you one story from each category. By the way, according to the descriptions of her contemporaries, she looked like the most common woman. She was neither of exceptional stature, nor of any demonic looks. Even more, her build and features painted a picture of someone fragile and helpless. Many mention that during normal time, when not in trance, she often taken for an ordinary young attractive girl. The first stories about Alysardakh killing a shaman from a neighboring district called Ols. The conflict between the shamans was rather inert, until Alysardakh for some reason became strongly offended by Ols one day, and promised to destroy him before the summer's end. Ols, after hearing about it, took a defensive position, and for the rest of summer barely got out of his hut, constantly conducting rites and ceremonies to protect himself. Nevertheless, there were times when he dared to relax, and one such time, on a hot July day, he went to a neighboring glade, together with his relatives to mow down some hay and take a bath in a nearby lake. Taking a swim in the lake after lunch, Ols noticed a strange lonely cloud the color of rust on the western edge of the sky. In that very moment, a black raven flew over the croaking warily. The shaman's expression changed instantly. He told the others the raven was his spirit animal, and that the ominous sign meant that Alysardakh was coming after him, and promptly left for his hut. By the time he reached it, the cloud, growing larger and darker, almost overtook him. People, who happens to be in the cloud's path, later said that there was a torrential rain and strong whirlwinds, and that the size of the cloud changed constantly. Ols locked himself in his hut, closed all windows with magical plugs he prepared beforehand, changed into his shaman clothes, and, tambourine in hand, got down into the cellar dug underneath the hut. As the cloud covered his dwelling, an enormous black whirlwind, akin to a tornado, descended down from it, that people saw from the opposing edge of the glade. The whirlwind circled around the hut, ripping the contents of the yard to shreds, including the hitching post, as if not knowing how to approach the shaman's house. But then it jumped onto the roof and entered the house through the flue that ill-fated Ols forgot to cover. Loud and terrible noises, as well as screams, could be heard from the hut all evening, as the cloud disgorged thunder and lightning. Later it started moving again, and, heading back west, slowly dissipated. People were afraid to approach Ol's hut for several days. When they finally dared to, they found the interior of the hut in the state of terrible disorder. Everything was practically torn to shreds. The shaman himself lay cuddled in the cellar corner, pressing the tambourine to his breast. His face was a bloody mess. As for Alysardakh, who had spent all that time entranced, dancing in her house, as she came back to her senses, expressed regret at accidentally killing 2 lesser shamans from the same area who were in the way. Indeed, these shamans fell ill the same evening, and died in the next 2 to 3 days. The second story is more humorous than creepy, and shows that the Udagansha was not devoid of sense of humor. Once two men, bigwigs from the city, were going on a business trip through the village where Alysardakh lived, a reminder that was still imperial time. Having heard of a shaman living there, but putting much stock in the stories, they decided to pay her a visit, and seeing a pretty young girl instead of the terrible hag they expected made them behave in a much more forward manner. They ate, drank, discussed her out loud, and ultimately demanded Alysardakh showed them a magic trick. She modestly agreed and began simulating a trance. The men looked at it for 5 minutes, then 10, then half an hour, but got bored, and left, swearing. But as soon as opened the door to the street, a torrent of water has rushed into the house from the outside, as if the hut stood on the seafloor. The men were quickly wet, floundering in the icy water teeming with fish. And Alysardakh only laughed at them. They felt they were going to drown, and begged her to end the show. She graciously agreed and ordered each man to catch one fish. It took them great effort, but they did as was said. Meanwhile the water level was rising. And now, if you want to stop it, she said, squeeze these fish you caught with both two hands as firmly as you can. The men began to squeeze, and she was shouting, stronger, stronger. They squeezed so hard that the veins of their temples swelled up, as Alysardakh was hooting with laughter, looking at them. And suddenly the men came to their senses, only to discover that they were standing in the hut with their pants down and squeezing each other's dicks, before a crowd of onlookers. The people, naturally, all roll with laughter. The men blushed intensively, and rushed out of the hut, never to return. An interesting tidbit, the Yakut Shamans, with surprising unanimity, acknowledged that they all sucked balls next to the Tungus Shamans, who lived in the northern reaches of Yakutia. Even the great shamans were unwilling to poke their noses there. A regular Tungus Shaman can easily take our strongest ones, they said. There is a legend of one of the great Yakut Shamans, whose name I forgot, who suddenly went into a coma for 3 years. When he just as suddenly regained consciousness, he told that on the fateful night 3 years prior, he, having nothing better to do, possessed an eagle, his spirit animal, and flew off to see the world. As his journey took him to the northern territories, he suddenly spotted a giant eagle owl flying straight at him. It caught him as if he was a little mouse, and carried him to its nest, and there, having pressed its weight on him, held him captive for 3 years, and also would, naturally, take shit and piss right onto him. And only after 3 years he managed to snatch a moment when Eagle Owl got distracted, and the spirit of the Yakut Shaman could finally flee. As he said later, the Eagle Owl was one of spirit animals of a Tungus Shaman, i.e. when Yakut Shamans could only have one animal, a Tungus one could have many more. Such is the story. Here another pasta about a meeting of a Yakut and Tungus Shamans. One medium Yakut Shaman's journey took him to the northern regions once. It was winter time, and he traveled by cart pulled by a bull. Among his haul there were large chunks of beef that he got as payment for curing a sick man in some village. And thus, somewhere in the middle of nowhere he came upon a snow-covered Alas, where a small shabby hut lonely stood. It was clear that a poor man lived there. "You are welcome, Anon." And so our hero, who thought himself to be a wizard of the highest category, with pride level over 9,000, enters the hut, and finds an old man with an old woman inside. He tells them who he is, and to treat him accordingly. The old couple began to fuss and concocted a poor, but quite tolerable dinner, and the shaman, satisfied, went to sleep. Next morning he rose, ate breakfast and went on further on his journey, without even having speaking a word to the people. He rode all day long, but evening found him dumbstruck. He was in the very same Alas that he left from in the morning. The same hut, the same old man with the same old woman. The shaman shat bricks, checked on the spirits, but couldn't make heads or tails of it. Unable to think of anything else, he entered the hut once again, telling the couple that his cart broke down, and that he had spent the entire day fixing it, so they would have to welcome him for another night. The old couple reacted quietly. Again they made a poor dinner, this and that. The shaman couldn't sleep for long, tormented by distressing thoughts, but ultimately dozed off. In the morning he left again. The weather was nasty, and the road was almost lost under the snow, but the bull persistently crept forward. Come evening, the shaman spied a smoke trail, coming from a flue of a small hut. The very same hut, naturally. The shaman deduced what was causing it. Obviously he was a victim of a stronger sorcerer. But who? He could not feel a presence of another shaman anywhere nearby. This time he didn't even bother to explain himself, as he entered the hut for the third time. The old man and woman only quietly exchanged glances, and the woman said that there was no food left, as the shaman had eaten everything in the past 2 days. Mayhaps that day their guest would provide the meals? To that our hero, thinking of the beef chunks in his cart, only muttered that he had nothing. He did not intend to share his food with dirty peasants. The old man rose then, saying, "Well, we can't leave our guest hungry, looks like we'll have to cook our own meat today." The shaman understood nothing as he watched the woman bring an axe to her husband, who then sat down on the floor, bared his right leg, then took the axe to it. Blood everywhere, bones cracking, the shaman is in shock, while the man and the woman nonchalantly continue to chop the man's leg. With the task complete, the old man rose on one leg and began to chop the severed leg into pieces. He then gave the goods to his wife and told her to make soup. She calmly took the meat and left towards the furnace. It was then that the shaman finally realized who had been trolling him these past 3 days. Falling on his knees before the one-legged old man, he begged for forgiveness, begged for his life, as he did not know his folly. The old man, having wrapped the bloody stump in fabric, sat down on the chair and kept his silence. The shaman kept begging more and more. He even promised to give his nemesis all goods he carried with him, including even the bull with the cart. Meanwhile the soup was ready, and the old woman called the men to eat. The old man ordered the shaman to the table with a gesture. He had no choice but to sit down and enjoy the macabre broth, which was, nonetheless, quite tasty, with no strange flavors. And then they went to bed. The shaman, naturally, spent all night without a second of sleep, but didn't try to flee either, as he knew it to be in vain. In the morning the old man finally broke his silence. By the way, the leg grew back too. He allowed the guest to get out of his house, leaving all his belongings and the bull behind. The shaman happily obliged. Before leaving, he took a quick glance on his cart, and saw one chunk of beef missing, just enough to brew some soup. The last one for today. Concerning shamans and such, I will make a small break, but promise to paint a thorough picture of all I know about them later, with some pastas too. I just don't feel composed enough to write another wall of text at the time. For now a small pasta from local classics. I heard a crapton of different versions of it. One village family had cattle problems, either cows would not get pregnant, kolanabit, or the calves were stillborn, torbostubat. In the event a calf was actually born, it would be very sickly, and usually wouldn't live a week. The folklore provides 2 possible reasons. A. The family simply wasn't lucky, maybe the spirits of the cattle offered them no patronage, most likely due to some past or present sins. B. The calf eater, Torbiakabasida, a lesser evil spirit that fed on souls of calves. It was a problem, sure, but what of it, especially since this took place during the 60s or 70s, rather than in ancient times. But one day the woman came back home early. The family had a child about 5 years old, who would stay at home while the parents were working, and found the kid playing with some pieces of wood in the barn. More importantly, before entering the bar, she could clearly hear the kid talking to someone. 2 distinct voices could be made out. Thoroughly interrogating her son, she learned that for quite some time now he had a new friend, a shaggy normal-looking fellow, dressed in fur clothes. The new friend was only seen inside the barn, and would appear from a dark corner. They would often play together, and the shaggy boy was profiting from the relationship too, having convinced the kid to occasionally bring him food from the family table. And also insisted that the boy never spoke of him to anybody, especially to his parents, or I will not play with you ever again. The woman shat a good amount of construction materials and told everything to her husband. The family was sure, the calf eater. But what could be done? The head of the family consulted knowledgeable people in the village, and ended up giving his son a sharp steel Yakut knife. "Hide it in your clothes," he said, "play it cool. When this new friend of yours shows up again, hit him in the face and shiv his gut." The little Yakut kid agreed to kill his friend without any emo bullshit. Next morning the kid went to the barn with a big trickle of tasties. He sat down in the center of the barn, and began to play alone. This time the friend did not appear for long, and when he did, he was obviously looking very alerted. "I feel a disturbance in the force, something is afoot," he said warily, to which the kid replied, "Don't be a chicken, all's well. Here, I have a cool little something, let's play." Hesitantly, the fur-clad fellow approached the kid and began eating the food greedily. That's when the kid, with his friend distracted, pulled out the knife from under his pants leg and shoved him right in the guts. The barn was filled with a terrible shriek, and the kid fainted. When he recovered, he saw that he was alone in the barn, the food was left half-eaten, and the knife was still in his hand, with the blade covered in thick, almost black blood. The friend was nowhere to be seen. He did not appear again, and the cattle began to breed normally. And the kid grew up and became alpha as hell. Happy end. Well, the thread is on its way to the archive, so I will create a new one tomorrow for more stories, unless there will be a suitable thread already. They say our city of Yakutsk, translator's note, regional capital of Yakutia, is choke full of ghosts and spirits. People often tell stories of abasi, evil spirits, tormenting honest folks. I never believed those stories. At all. Only laughed at them, and at the people who took them seriously. They just never managed to impress me. But a day came when my impregnable skepticism was finally breached. Here's the story: I urgently needed to find a place to live. And luckily, it didn't take long to find one. You probably know this kind of houses, 9 stories, each full of small apartments, kinda reminded me of an anthill, TN, a very common type of apartment blocks, late Soviet built. You can find them in virtually any Russian city. Minuscule proportions of the apartment were no problem for a single person, and I, a student at the time, didn't mind the building's overcrowdedness too. It was almost in the city center, this apartment, and you could see an old church from the window, a very rustic view. Most importantly, it was rather cheap, almost too good to be true. It was owned by a family of newlyweds, who, for some strange reason, opted to live with the parents instead. Looking back, I should have known something was wrong. Especially since I knew that that residential district was built over an old cemetery, the only remainder of was the aforementioned church. But alas, I careless and happy, so I moved in immediately. All I had was a folding bed, a table, and a couple of chairs. I settled in, drew a watercolor funny bunny on the bathroom door, hung up the blinds, tried my best to make the place cozy. One peculiarity soon became apparent: the windows were on the south side of the building, so during the summer time it should have been hot as hell. And yet even on the hottest days it was cold like in a crypt. During the first night I was woken up by a terrible puffing from under the bed. I thought to myself, the walls must be pretty thin, to be able to hear the neighbor's breath. Only in the morning I realized that that wall had no neighbors behind it, only the street, as the apartment was in the corner of the house. The closest neighbors were on the other side of the kitchen and bathroom. So, there was no way for me to hear them from the room. I was surprised, but nothing more. In several days' time I was surprised even more, when I was woken up by a rhythmic noise of small bare feet running around. Water was running in the bathroom, and child's small wet footmarks traces could be seen appearing on the floor. Appearing and disappearing right there and then. To say that I was shocked would be to say nothing. I decided that it must have been a dream. I could not think up another explanation. So I went back to bed and went back to sleep. When the nights became darker by the end of summer, the real horror began. I couldn't explain why, but was feeling pure dread. I started leaving the lights on during the night. Soon the lights broke. I called electricians, and they repaired the wires, but on the next day they broke again, so I called the electricians again. Soon they were coming 5 times a week. I am not exaggerating. I was pissed. You can't even properly fix it, and you call yourselves experts? The wiring breaks in a different place every time. They tried to explain. Also, here's the last thread. Once a friend of mine stopped by for a couple of weeks. After the first spent at my place, she said, "You know, you should really at least sprinkle the place with some holy water, perhaps." I swear I could hear some weird noises all night long. Terrible. How can you even live here alone? A lone light bulb, without even a lampshade, served as the source of light in the room. And so, as soon as Jinya, the friend's name, was done speaking, it fell down. The cord simply snapped in the middle, as if someone pulled strongly at it. The electricians who came to repair it, joked that me and Jinya must have swung on it, like monkeys. We promptly decided to visit the church, gathered some holy water and, reading Our Father out loud, sprinkled the whole apartment, each wall, and each corner. And you know what? It became easier to breathe. There was silence, the light did not break, the tap did not open on its own, nobody ran around at night. For about 3 days. And then everything began anew with full force. And the remainder of holy water in a clean can became covered with mold. My mother, by the way, has some holy water from a baptism celebration of some years ago, and it's still as pure and clean as ever. Once Jinya left, spending time in the became apartment nigh impossible. Especially in the kitchen, without any known reasons. Entering it in the dark was followed by an overwhelming sense of dread. Anyway, here's how the story ends. One evening I left my handbag in the kitchen. Come night I did not dare to go get it. And on the next morning I discovered a small palm print, seemingly of a child's palm on it, with one finger missing. It did not come off regardless of what cleaning agents I used. I couldn't spend one more night there. I quickly rented a room elsewhere, moved my things, returned the keys to the owners. By the way, they didn't even ask what was the reason for such a sudden departure. Also, a note, this story is told from a woman's perspective. Afraid there won't be many stories today. I am not feeling so well, and have a lot to do at home too. Before moving to Yakutsk, I lived in a small settlement, in a 3-room apartment in a relatively recently built stone house. I emphasize it was built of stone, not of wood, therefore, various sounds and noises cannot settle in the walls, as it sometimes happens in wooden buildings. The events that occurred there, while not outright frightening, are still spooky and unsettling enough. First case. I was in 4th grade, TN, about 10 to 11 years old, and shared the bed with my mother, as she was very ill. During the night she would be tormented by nightmares, and I had to play an alarm clock, that is to wake her up, because she would seldom be able to wake up from such nightmares unaided. That night was just as the others before. Mother was asleep, and so was I. But then I suddenly woke up. I felt as if I was pulled out from some space in which there is no time. That's how strange I felt. It was not at all similar to being sleepy. So, opening my eyes, I involuntarily looked towards the anteroom. The mother's room was adjacent to it, as if something attracted my gaze. It was winter, and the night was very dark, yet in this complete darkness I could see someone's eyes staring at us, bright red, narrow, without pupils. Just eyes, I could not see anybody or even a silhouette. As soon as I looked at them, they disappeared. Note, this story is also told by a woman. I was shaking. Trying to calm myself, I attempted to rationalize that all this was just a dream. I nestled up to my sleeping mother and closed my eyes, trying to fall asleep. My mind simply refused to accept that I had seen, and as soon as I closed my eyes, I felt someone throw a small round object at my forehead. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. Moreover, I expected to hear the object bounce from me and fall elsewhere, but there was nothing, as if it had disappeared, absolute silence. How I then calmed myself and, eventually, managed to fall asleep, I still do not understand. Were it to happen to me now, I would scream at the top of my lungs. Later I tripped and seriously hit my head, the exact same place that was hit by the little ball. I got a concussion that resulted in an increase of the cranial pressure, which consequently affected my sight, progressing short-sightedness of the 2nd degree. That is to say, my sight gets worse every year. I honestly have no idea what it was, and nor do I especially want to know. Later, by the way, I saw those eyes once more. They were directly over our bed. The second case isn't as terrible as the first, and praise the Lord for that. I very much enjoyed rock music, and in my parents' absence I would crank the volume up. Thankfully, the walls were thick. And so, one evening I, as always, put on some punk rock, and literally the same moment I heard a heavy, blood-chilling sigh somewhere nearby. At first I paid it no mind, but the second sigh forced me to prick up my ears. I was home alone, after all. I turned the music off and kept listening, not a sound. Okay, turned it on again, someone sighing. I turned the music off again and checked if the door was locked, and maybe if someone was outside the apartment, but found nothing out of the ordinary. Feeling uneasy, I returned to my room and again turned the music on, this time just to see what would happen. And again someone began to sigh. That's when I became really afraid, so I turned off not only music, but the computer too, turned on the light and began reading the book. Afterwards I did not risk listening loud music again. Third case. More and more often I found myself thinking something very wrong was going on in our apartment. With the corner of my eye I could sometimes see dark figures, that would vanish as soon as I turned to look at them. Once, as I was cleaning up my room, while listening to music via headphones, with the corner of my eye I spied something small and dark climbing up my chair. I quickly turned my head, and there nothing. And this kept happening almost every week. Something ran by, something flew by, and sometimes a black shadow just stood there. Later I learned just with the corner of one's eye is how people usually spot supernatural entities. For some time I had a habit to wake up at 5 a.m. and just lie in bed until dawn. And so, woken up, as always, by my biological clock, I heard a chair creak from kitchen. Usually such sounds can be heard when moving furniture. I wondered why parents rose so early. But when I asked them later, during the day, they both insisted they were merrily sleeping at that time, and were nowhere near the kitchen. The only thought I could think was, I heard similar sounds later when a girlfriend of mine was sleeping over. My brother heard it too. Once our 5-year-old cousin was staying with us, and we were scaring her for fun, telling her the boogeyman would come and take her away. We knocked on the door to the room, not the apartment, saying, "Here, can you hear that? He is knocking for you." The child, naturally, began to cry, and we stopped the tomfoolery, and that's when we heard genuine knocking at the door from the other side. My God, never before or after have I ran as fast as at that very moment. Together with my brother-cousin we rushed to the balcony and locked ourselves there, for we knew that there was no one but us at home at that time. There are plenty articles on Russian, but next to nothing in English. I can take a small break from pastas and translate some of them instead. The fourth case is connected with a seance. Everyone is probably familiar with divination on a plate. You need a not too deep plate or a saucer, clean, without any ornaments, cover its bottom with soot, draw an arrow, light the candles and so on. Many say that it's just laws of physics moving the plate, rather than anything supernatural. Nonsense. Me and my girlfriend decided to hold a seance like that out of pure curiosity. We had neither soot, nor matches, nor candles. Instead we used eyeshadow, which we used to cover the plate's bottom. By the way, the plate had a gilded border, drew an arrow with a pencil, and substituted candles for mobile, setting display lighting at the maximum setting. And now try to imagine our horror when the plate actually began to move on its own, without any assistance. At first I thought that my friend was playing a prank on me, and asked her to stop. She stopped touching the plate, and I, horrified, understood that nobody was playing pranks, the seance was real, and the plate was moving on its own. It is also worth mentioning that a number of rules were not followed. The seance had to have odd number of participants. We were two. In a hurry we forgot to write down the Yakut alphabet. And the spirit of the dead Yakut we had summoned was angrily looking for the Yakut letters that weren't there. Such seances can only be carried out during the so-called Tanha period, that is during the Christmas tide, and lastly, the participants were not to touch the plate. Nevertheless, the spirits kept answering our calls. We were enjoying it more and more, until we realized that some of spirits were not among the ones we called. We threw out all the damned objects, save for our phones, into a ditch, and yet for 2 or 3 days that followed we felt as if we were watched by some dark shadows. I cannot ever forget this stupid game of ours, especially since the idea was mine. Fifth case. While I lived in that house, and generally all the time I spent in that town, nearly every night, I kept seeing strange, bad dreams. I will provide several examples. When I was 8 years old, my grandmother died. A year or 2 later she often visited me in my dreams and asking me to leave with her, to allow her to remain with me. For some reason I adamantly didn't want to go with her, however I would often allow her to remain with me. It kept happening until one of our relatives committed self-end by shooting himself, because of a serious illness. At the night of his death I dreamt of my grandmother frying flapjacks. My old dog, Sokol, TN, Sokol means falcon in Russian, was sitting near me. "Hurry up, dear, we've got a guest today," the grandmother told me. Why I needed to hurry and what I was supposed to do I did not know. I only remember running around the kitchen on her errands, with Sokol following me. On the next day I learned that Sokol died a year ago. After that I didn't dream of my grandmother anymore. Once dreamed how together with a friend of mine we robbed someone's house, but we were quickly overtaken by the militia, and we fled. For some reason I came running home, locked the door behind me and begged my father not to let them have me. He didn't seem to care much, and said something about it being my problem, which was strange, as in reality Dad is usually very concerned with my well-being. And right there and then I heard furious knocking at the door. I ran up to it and furtively looked through the peephole. The landing was full of cops. I remember a fearful thought, my God, have I really committed so many crimes? I ran up to a window, intending to jump out of it, but, having barely opened it, saw it to be fruitless. There was complete darkness outside the window and an awful and cold snowstorm. While I contemplated the situation I found myself in, the cops busted down the door and arrested me. Later I learned that my friend and accomplice was caught as well, and we were sentenced to death via shooting squad. The last thing I remember were the black barrels of guns letting out ear-deafening shots. On the following morning I learned that they arrested my classmate who, along with his friend, robbed the house. They were using a window to take things out when the owner returned. He handed the would-be thieves over to the cops, and the classmate, who didn't exactly behave himself prior to that, assault, carjacking, small-time vandalism, damage to property, alcohol consumption in public places, etc. Got a very big sentence that he is still serving. Well, and, of course, it wouldn't be business as usual without evil spirits involved. Once I dreamt about a big black man. Honestly though, I do not whether it could be called a man at all, rather, something man-shaped, and problems in life soon followed: quarrels, arguments, poor health. I hope you understand why I have no love for the town and the house. Having moved to Yakutsk, I, perhaps, for the first time in life learned what it meant to sleep peacefully and not fearing to dream of some devilry. By the way, I had no more visions or strange dreams ever since I moved, but whenever I go back to the hometown, everything begins anew. Also, living in the capital improved my health too. When I lived in the town, I was spending a lot of time bedridden, suffering terrible headaches, due to cranial pressure. Sometimes I would sleep for 2 to 3 days straight, getting up only to eat and to use the toilet. I very much hope to never encounter the supernatural again in my life. One of the most terrible and mysterious events in my life took place not so long ago, only 2 years ago, when I went to my home village during my summer vacation. Since I was a young boy, I believed that invisible forces were all around us, affecting our world, and not always in a good way. But what I had witnessed on one summer evening on an empty road near the village made me change the word believe to a more definite new. That, and, to tell the truth, gave me many sleepless nights and an overwhelming inexplicable fear of the native woods. Summer in a Yakut village is a special time. While the city considers the summer a time for rest and fun, the village is teeming with work. Haymaking, that's what occupies the hearts and minds of the villagers, making them rise together with the first beams of the morning sun and to spend all their time until late evening on the fertile glades. We in Yakutia call them alassi. The northern summer is fleeting, so it is necessary to mow down enough hay for all the farming needs, to pack it down to stacks and get them back to the village. And before you know it, you will feel autumn's breath on the back of your head. But at the same time, haymaking is also relaxation. If you were born and grew up in a village, then it is your holy duty to spend at least a few weeks of every summer in an alas, inhaling the rich aroma of a freshly cut grass, listening to birds singing and enjoy the crystal clear waters of the lakes and rivers the Alassi are famous for. Therefore, having passed all the bothersome exams at the university, I, immediately and without thinking, got on a bus and went home. The first week we spent mowing down hay on a river island, valiantly withstanding the attacks of mosquitoes and gnats, of which there were whole clouds in damp air. By a certain point, you can no longer feel the bites, and the skin stops swelling. Having finished all work on the island, we had gotten over to one of those alas located approximately 10 kilometers from our village. We went there in my stepfather's old truck, having loaded the cart trailer with all the necessary equipment, scythes, rakes and pitchforks. Haymaking in an alas is a much easier endeavor than on an island, and not just because there are less insects. The main difference is the ground. Alas ground is a lot more even and flat, there are far less stones and roots that could easily shatter your scythe. A seasoned worker haymaking would spend almost no effort working there. While I cannot say that about myself, even I could breathe easier when we left the island. Usually we would be done by 8 p.m. and return to the village on the same truck. But soon I developed a habit of taking my old trusty bicycle with me on the cart trailer, which I had since the early years of school, and to return home alone, enjoying the chill evenings and satisfaction from the hard work done. Even more so, since it was only taking me about half an hour, and made for a much more pleasant experience than trying to fit inside the stuffy salon of the truck in the company of my not very talkative stepfather. That evening did not become an exception. We prepared several dozen shocks of hay, which we then needed to bring together into a single big stack. When the sun began to sink towards the west, my stepfather gathered the equipment and left. It was, I reckon, around 8:30 p.m. I, on the other hand, stayed to swim in a small lake in the middle of the glade. I remained in an alassi and have much a good swim in the small lake which was in the center of a glade. I was in excellent mood, saddened only by the ooze on the bottom of the shallow lake soiling my legs. Swimming in a river was more pleasant, the current created gave you a special feeling, and at the bottom would be covered with clean yellow sand. Having left the lake, I got dressed and got on the bicycle. By then the sun had taken on a purple-red hue, usually that was interpreted as a rain warning. I was rotating the pedals, the wheels lazily scattered small stones which were plentiful on the dirt road. Both sides of the road were filled with conifers, but occasionally I could see a birch or a larch, such are the woods here. The abundance of pines darkened the road. Together with the bright red disk of the sun incessantly flashing behind the trunks, it was a wondrous sight to behold. The fateful meeting took place after about 4 kilometers. The woods parted on the right side of the road there, opening to one's view the next, alas, surrounded by a low wooden fence. Those are usually erected by the landowners to protect the hay from roaming cows, horses, and other misfortunes. There was not a soul there at that hour, but in the distance I could see the yellow shapes of haystacks. At the left side there was a thin small river, so there weren't too many trees there too. Ahead of me was an abrupt turn, preventing one from seeing if anyone was riding towards a place of an increased risk of a road accident, according to Guy officers. TN, GIBD, or Guy, as it was formerly known, is the traffic department of the Russian police. There are loads upon loads of so-called evil spots on the roads of Yakutia, places allegedly, of supernatural occurrences, a gray-haired old woman with a staff chasing down cars. Or a young girl trying to hitch a ride by the roadside only to suddenly disappears then from the car without any traces. Each such story, as a general rule, is preceded by a chilling account of the past events at that place. An old woman was hit by a truck here, a girl hung herself on a tree nearby there. But my road never had such stories to tell. If someone were to even once notice anything supernatural there, it wouldn't take long for the whole village to trade whispers about it for the next 100 years. So, I thought then, I was lucky. You are welcome, Anon. Thank you too for starting this whole thing. Having admired the red-lit view for long enough, I turned my gaze back to the road in time to spot a rider on a horse appear from behind a sharp turn. It was a bay horse, moving at trotting speed. It was not a strange sight in those parts. Live transport is popular in Yakutia, and in many respects was more convenient than cars. I kept riding my bicycle towards the rider. Now, looking back, I should have noticed a very disturbing sign, specifically the fact that the horse's hoofs did not make any sound when hitting the ground. The horse moved without a sound, but back then I didn't notice it. The animal seemed tired to me, as it kept its head down. The rider was motionless and looking dead ahead. From the distance I distinguished that he was dressed in dark clothes, but, such was an unspoken custom here, and I myself was wearing gray shirt and brown pants. As I was approaching the lone rider, I felt, intuitively, without thinking, that something was not right with him. And in just a couple of moments I realized with terrible clarity exactly what was ticking me off, that what simply couldn't be there, were the rider an ordinary man. His legs were terribly long, so long, in fact, that, despite the horse's considerable height, were dragged on the ground. Those legs did not end in feet either, but were simply getting thinner and thinner until there was nothing left. That were the legs. The second observation which made my hair stand concerned the horse itself. I could not see earlier, from the front, but having approached closer, I was now looking at it from the side, and I spied another terrible violation of proportions. The horse was long. Same as legs of its rider. It only had 4 legs, if I recall correctly, but its body stretched for many long meters, the length of 3 normal horses, I'd say. That alone would be enough to make a man faint, but I had the misfortune to not be satisfied yet, and raised my eyes towards the face of terrible rider. As soon as I did, and my memory gets hazy here, I experienced a painful fall, and a stench, similar to burning rubber, filled my nose. It must have simply passed me by, without paying me much mind. Anyway, having regained my consciousness, I found myself lying on the ground with my bicycle nearby, and a burning sensation in my right shin. Nothing serious, as it later turned out, just ripped the skin a little bit, and the road was once again empty. The smell was gone too. I could only smell the countryside air. The sun had only moved by a little bit. I was not fainted for long. Its blood-red light nearly made me vomit. With my back covered in goosebumps, I somehow got up and back onto the bicycle. The leisurely pace of before was out of question. I rode as fast as I could turn the pedals, periodically checking back to see if anything was chasing me. It took me 15 minutes to reach the village, although it felt like an hour, and when I did, I let out a sigh of relief. I could hear music playing from someone's yard, a chainsaw's squeal, the hubbub of children playing around. All this soothed my mind and helped dispel the terrible and feverish memories. I simply could not keep it to myself and told my parents everything. We all agreed that the being was a so-called passing spirit, that was headed elsewhere. Local campfire folklore has many stories of similar encounters. Theoretically, such spirit could do me no harm, but it hardly made me feel better. After that, I, of course, stopped taking the bicycle ride home. Even leaving the house at night for the bathroom was a challenge. Eventually, though, the bright colors began to fade, and I hope that in time I will manage to somehow suppress my fears. But one feature of the terrible rider, the one I would never forget, I did keep to myself. It was simply too terrible to even recall, as the mental image alone, I felt, would make me faint again, even now, when I am alone at night, bulging, and sharp, like paper cutouts, human-like eyes, that took most of the horse's face. Well, see you tomorrow, ANONS, I'm off to sleep. Yakuts are afraid of the dead. Well, I mean, everyone is, but, according to the Yakut beliefs, if a dead person appears, whether in a dream or IRL, to the living, especially to its relatives, then it's certain that the spirit is trying to pull the soul of the living person into the other world. There are exceptions, of course. For example, if a recently deceased relative tries to deliver a message or a request in a dream, tell my daughter that there are 9,000 rubles hidden under the pillow, but to usually see dead people is a bad sign. This pasta is exactly about that. There once lived an old man in a small town. He had a big house, but had no relatives, so he decided to rent a room out to a girl who was doing an internship at the local hospital. They were on good terms, didn't stand in each other's way, and would sometimes talk about this or that in the evenings. On winter evening the girl was returning home from the hospital. Entering the yard, the snow crunched somewhere on the opposite side of it. The darkness did not allow her to see who it was, and she just thought that the old man went out to do some chores. What surprised her about it, though, was that the person was wheezing, or groaning loudly, as if choking on something. The girl asked out loud, "Who's there?" And the strange noises ceased. Having stood there a little, the girl started feeling uncomfortable and entered the house. She found the old man sitting by the furnace, and realized that it couldn't have been him. Quietly shitting bricks, she decided to tell him nothing, not wanting to scare the old man. During the supper she noticed that the old man seemed rather gloomy. He explained, "When I took a nap after lunch, I dreamt of my younger brother, who passed away 2 decades ago. He kept calling me, asking me to go with him, but I refused. A bad sign was." The girl was spooked, but opted to say nothing. The night came, and they each went to their rooms. The girl couldn't sleep, and she was just turning in her bed. The old man was sleeping in the next room, and she could clearly hear his uneven breath. Suddenly, right outside the girl's window, the snow crackled again, and she could hear the flattering wheezing breath once more, as if someone had just finished a fucking marathon, and couldn't catch his breath. The girl hid under the blanket, overwhelmed with fear. A minute passed, and the footsteps moved over to the window of the old man's room. And at that very moment the girl heard the man's breath change. He began to puff and wheeze too, turning in his bed. The girl thought she should wake him up, but the guest outside was breathing loudly, almost in unison with the old man, and so she was afraid to get out from under the blanket. She didn't know how long it had lasted until she fell asleep. First thing in the morning, after the sun rose, she went to check the snow under the windows, but found no footsteps of any kind. Having let out a sigh of relief, she came back inside to have breakfast. The old man was even gloomier than before. He had seen his brother again, who, this time, was angry and tried to force the old man to go with him. I fought as much as I could, but in the end he knocked me down and dragged me away by force, the old man sighed. Here the girl, at last, decided to tell the old man everything she witnessed. Having heard it, the old man had gotten depressed. You should have woken me up before he overpowered me. It was him. I'm sure I remember how terrible his wheezing was, shortly before he died of tuberculosis. Now I am gone too. And indeed, not 2 weeks had passed before the old man went down with pneumonia, and did not recover. He was buried next to his brother. And the girl moved away to another place. Some more about Yakuts and the dead. There is a belief, Deretnik, Casket Evening, that's what they call the evening of the day that saw someone pass away or get buried. It is believed that on such evenings spirits from the other side come to accompany the soul of the deceased person to the next world, and therefore the border between the visible and the invisible becomes thinner. Some may appear, who were not invited, so it is customary not to fuss outside too much, not to have fun, and generally not to draw too much attention to oneself. Otherwise some very undesirable guests may pay you a visit. This custom, of course, means very little in big cities, where people die every day, but it is zealously observed in smaller villages even today. Yours truly personally forbade his younger brothers to play tag outside after the death of our grandmother. This is Yakutia, who knows what can happen. Now, the pasta. Once, in one village a very old man, who had a shitload of relatives, died. Naturally, the entire grieving family gathered in the village to set up a proper funeral. Among them were some small children, who, as kids do, quickly managed to chum up with each other. It was summertime, therefore the new friends organized some games in the fresh evening air, and what else were they supposed to do, sit inside a stuffy house, looking at gloomy faces? Of course, this all was accompanied by shouts, laughter, and other hubbub. Some of the old people would sometimes try to stop them. Deretnik, you shouldn't fuss so much, but generally the children were their own masters. When they became bored with tag, the children decided to play hide and seek in the yard. One kid, around 10, was chosen as the seeker. The children made themselves scarce, and he started looking. Some he found quickly. And then he entered the winter house, which was left empty during summertime, to be used as a warehouse. Even though those were summer nights, it was still very dark inside. The kid checked all the rooms, nothing. On his way out, he spotted a big wardrobe. Some of his little relatives could very well be inside. Passing by it with a poker face, he sharply turned to open it, but found only winter clothes inside, jackets, coats. He suspected that someone could still be behind those, and started feeling with his hands. Running a hand up the sleeve of a big coat, the kid suddenly felt something cold. He took a look, and saw a knife shining from behind the sleeve. Surprised, his hand automatically kept going further. It turned out that the knife was held by someone's ice-cold hand. The kid moved the coat aside and saw behind it a 2-meter tall man looking down on him. The dark didn't allow to make out his face, and a foul stench hit the kid's nose. Screaming at the top of his lungs, the kid flew out of the house and told the other children what he saw. A crowd of them went back to the house to check, only to find nothing but clothes in the wardrobe. So they just laughed at the kid, calling him a little coward, and went back to their games. Another boy was to be the seeker in the following round. Business was as usual, everybody hid, and the boy began his search. After some wandering he entered a barn in the far corner of the lot. As the barn windows were small, there was very little light, but the boy still distinctly saw a person hiding in the corner. "I found you," the boy said, "come out." Standing still, he put a finger to his mouth, as if playfully suggesting to keep the silence, and began laughing quietly, like he was finding the situation very funny. The boy approached him. "Come out," I said. And from up close he saw that the guy was not at all one of his friends, but a bald naked little man with shining round eyes, located disproportionately high, nearly on the forehead, a chubby bulging stomach and a tongue hanging down from his mouth all the way to his neck. The boy shat his pants, literally, and flew out onto the street in a moment's notice. When he came running to his parents and hysterically told them everything, coupled with the first boy telling his story, the adults strictly forbade the children to play out on the street in the next few days. Fun and games came to an end. A moral is usually added: to any occupation there is suitable time, but as we are not moral fags, the lesson for us is that you shouldn't hang around dark places when a corpse lies nearby.